Hello, and welcome to this webinar sponsored by the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning at St. John's University here in central Minnesota. My name is John Merkel, and I have the pleasure of directing the J. Phillips Center and also teaching in the Department of Theology at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, which are partner institutions with a common curriculum. Today's webinar is focused on the book Shia, Islam, and Politics, subtitled Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon, by my colleague and friend Jon Armajani, Professor of Peace Studies here at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. This is Jon's fourth book, and those of you who have had the opportunity to read one or more of his previous books know what a formidable scholar he is, as do his students. I can assure you that this book of Jon's provides an important and clarifying perspective on some of the most controversial and complicated political and religious issues of our time. Jon will be interviewed by Jason Schlude, Professor of Classics, here at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, where he also chairs the Department of Languages and Cultures. Jon Armajani earned his PhD in religious studies with a focus on Islamic and Middle Eastern studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Jason Schlude earned his PhD in ancient history and Mediterranean archaeology at the University of California in Berkeley. And Jason is the author of the book Rome, Parthia, and the Politics of Peace, The Origins of War in the Ancient Middle East. I can't think of anyone to give us a better introduction to Shia, Islam, and politics than Jon Armajani, nor anyone I would prefer to interview him on this topic than my friend and colleague, Jason Schlude. I also want to extend a special welcome to those joining us from Beirut, Lebanon, where Jon spent a good part of 6 summers doing research, much of which has informed this remarkable new book of his. And I want to thank our co-sponsors. Here at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, we have 3 co-sponsors: the Peace Studies Department, the Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement, and the CSB SJU chapter of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, of which Jon and Jason are both members. We also have 2 co-sponsors at the University of St. Thomas. Our partner, J. Phillips Center there, which is titled the J. Phillips Center for Interreligious Studies, and also the Encountering Islam program. I also want to thank Jen Schwichtenberg and Bernie Donlin, with whom I have the joy of working in the J. Phillips Center, and to Adam Bauer of IT Services here at CSB SJU. Each of them provided great help in preparing for this webinar. And now, to Jon Armajani and Jason Schlude.
Jon, thank you for that very gracious introduction. Let me also thank the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning for hosting this event. I'm really, really excited about our conversation today. I'd also like to thank our viewers and our listeners who are out there today for joining us in this conversation. We look forward to incorporating your questions when we can in our discussion. And if I can, let me thank Jon Armajani. Jon, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for your willingness to discuss this book. Thank you for the book, and congratulations on its publication. A book like this is a long-term investment in terms of your thinking, in terms of your research, and we're glad you made it. And with that, I'd say, why don't we go ahead and get to it? What I thought I would do, or we could do, is begin with some broader questions to set the scene and to better understand this project, Jon. Your book is one that focuses on Shia Islam and its relationship to Sunni Islam and how that maps onto the political world of the Middle East and the West as well. And you trace this relationship starting in the 7th century CE, and you bring it all the way up to the present moment. Now, I'm wondering if you would mind, for those of us who are unfamiliar, whether you could explain for us the difference between Shia and Sunni Islam to set the stage for the rest of our conversation today.
Absolutely. I'll be happy to do so, Jason. Thanks for the question. I thank Dr. John Merkel for all of his work in organizing this event and inviting me to be part of this interview. I also thank the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning. I think, in addition to thanking Dr. John Merkel and the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Jason Schlude, for interviewing me and all the work you've done in preparation for this interview. I thank Dr. Hans Gustafsson, Ms. Jen Schwichtenberg, Ms. Bernie Donlin, Mr. Adam Bauer, and all of our colleagues at CSBSJU's IT Services, the entire CSBSJU community, and all the co-sponsors who were listed on the initial poster which we saw and which John Merkel mentioned. So in terms of Sunni and Shiite Islam, well, Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims are both Muslims, and they represent two different branches of Islam. Approximately 90% of all Muslims in the world are Sunnis, and approximately 10% are Shiites or Shias. Those words are synonymous. So all Muslims, be they Sunnis or Shias, believe in one God. They believe in the importance of the Prophet Muhammad as the final or the seal of the prophets. They believe that the Quran contains the actual words of God. They both practice relatively similar prayers every day and so on. They have other similarities. However, the split between Sunni and Shiite Islam occurred very early in the history of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad, who is the most important prophet for all Muslims, passed away in 632 of the Common Era. That is to say 632 AD, just over 600 years after the emergence of Christianity. And there was an enormous dispute over who Muhammad's successor would be. And one of the reasons that Muhammad's successor was and is so important to Muslims is because Muhammad himself was a leader in many ways. Muhammad was a religious leader, a political leader, a spiritual leader, an economic leader, a military leader, etc. And it was understood that the person who would succeed Muhammad would lead the community in these and other ways. So that person had very big shoes to fill. Shiites believe that the rightful successor of Muhammad was his cousin and son-in-law, a man by the name of Ali. Shiites believe that Muhammad specifically stated that he wanted Ali to be his successor. Shiites emphasize the enormous spiritual gifts and even spiritual perfection that Ali possessed. And they believe he was particularly righteous, so they place an enormous amount of emphasis on the greatness of Ali. In terms of the Sunni Muslims believe that a very important Muslim leader by the name of Abu Bakr should have been Muhammad's successor. Abu Bakr was a very important military leader. Sunni Muslims believe he had a very deep and profound understanding of Islam. They believe that he was a very righteous person. They say that when Muhammad was on his deathbed, he stated that he wanted Abu Bakr to lead the prayers, and that was what Muhammad did when Muhammad was alive and feeling well. And Abu Bakr also allowed Muhammad to marry Abu Bakr's daughter Aisha, who in and of herself is a very significant figure for Sunni Muslims. Finally, there are 102 Sunni caliphs who succeeded Muhammad from 632 to 1924, with Abu Bakr being the first. And then, so religious leadership and political leadership in terms of the Sunni caliphs is very important for the Sunnis. And then on the flip side of that, in terms of the Shiites, there are 12 infallible imams who altogether, including Ali, who succeeded Muhammad from a lineage through Ali. So those are a few of the similarities and differences between Sunnis and Shiites.
Okay, thank you. So a great deal of common ground as you described, and what set them in different trajectories initially was this issue of leadership succession. That was very useful. Thank you very much, Jon.
You're welcome.
A book on the Middle East can be written in a variety of different ways, right? A book on the modern Middle East. You can have different foci to it, different goals that are behind it. Can you tell us what led you to write your book specifically on Shiite Islam? Why did you do that? And what have you looked to achieve in this book in doing so?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that there are many good and very helpful books about Shiite Islam that are available. And they have been enormously helpful to me in my life as a scholar and as a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And most or all of those books were sources that I consulted for my book and referenced them and so on. So I was working on a very strong foundation, I believe, because there's so much strong scholarship on Shiite Islam. However, in my view, there was a little bit of a gap in the literature that I thought could be filled. Because in terms of looking at the other books and trying to decide what I could assign for my undergraduate students at St. Ben's and St. John's, what I'd been looking for many years was a book that provided a historical, chronological treatment of Shiite Islam in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon. And the reason that those three countries are so important is because as a percentage of the population of each of those countries, they have a high Shiite population within the Middle East. And also, Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon have been and continue to be very vibrant centers for Shiite intellectual activity. So in writing this book, I wrote what I hoped would be the kind of book that would make Shiite Islam and politics accessible to my students in a clear chronological way. I wanted the book to focus chronologically on these three countries, and I tried as hard as I could to use clear vocabulary, and whenever I use technical terms, to try to define them within the text. So that was what motivated me to write the book in part.
Can I press a little bit more on that, maybe? And just thinking about your style in this book, right? People write books with different styles. So other than the topic you might select, the subject you might select, some folks write a book specifically to be a provocateur. You know, you want to be provocative. You want to lean into one direction or another and argue hard for one angle or another. The book that you deal with is one that deals with a lot of disagreements that take place between Shiites on the one hand, Sunnis on the other. It's a book that also documents many disagreements and hostilities that were shared between the Shiite world on the one hand and the West and the United States in particular on the other, right? So one could write a book like this to be deliberately provocative, right? To lean into a perspective that is very sympathetic to the United States, or to lean into a perspective that's very sympathetic to the Shiite world. How did you tackle that one? I would be interested to hear. I have my own thoughts in terms of how this came across, but what were you trying to do with it? Were you trying to be that provocateur?
No.
Why not? Tell me more about that.
Well, I was 14 years old when the Islamic Revolution occurred in Iran in 1979. And in the run-up to Iran's Islamic Revolution, and I was born in the United States, and I'm Iranian American. My parents were born in Iran. Many people my parents' generation were born in Iran. Actually, all of them were. So I felt a deeply personal connection to the country. And when we traveled to Iran on several occasions in the run-up to Iran's Islamic Revolution, even for me at a very young age, it was clear that something was going to happen in Iran. There were taxi drivers and people in the Iranian markets who had their ear very close to the ground who said a revolution in this country is on its way, largely because of the very repressive tactics and strategies and policies of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who was Iran's king. So then when the revolution happened in 1979, I mean, a lot of people were expecting it, some were not. And I was very dismayed at and about Western media coverage, particularly American media coverage about Iran's Islamic Revolution, because it did nothing to set the context for the reasons that millions of Iranians poured out into the streets and wanted to topple Iran's king. So I have two identities. I have one identity as an Iranian and another identity as an American. And so I think throughout my life, and even in my classes, I've wanted to explain Iran's Islamic Revolution, and I've wanted to explain the role of Islam in Iran, both during and after the revolution, in a manner that would generate the kind of context that was really lacking in the media. So what was I trying to do in the book? I wasn't trying to be provocative. I was just trying to be explanatory. And I was trying, in a sense, in a scholarly way, to try to empathize with the various people who were revolting against Iran's king. And it wasn't only people who wanted Ayatollah Khomeini to come into power. There was a broad coalition of very different people who succeeded in overthrowing Iran's king. So I wanted to make the revolution sensible, and I wanted to make Iran's Islamic government sensible to a Western audience. But at the same time, I don't want to alienate that audience, and I don't want to use inflammatory language. So I tried to show the ways in which the revolutionaries were critical of the United States, and to the extent possible, I tried to suggest an American perspective as well. So that's how I'd answer your question.
That's very useful to hear. And in a moment, I want to dig more into some of that historical background or some of that history of Iran that you're already referencing. But I might, if I can, just ask one quick follow-up. You know, you use the term empathy, and this is a term you mentioned in your book too. In your preface, you talk about this as a starting point, as a launch point for your project in some sense. And the result of it, at least to my reading, is a portrayal of Middle Eastern politics that's both highly sensitive and at points very highly critical of its actors. Both of those elements I find in your book. One could call that an even-handed approach. I can't help but ask, is this approach you typically adopt in your conversations with fellow scholars, with others? You've traveled extensively, including the Middle East, Lebanon, and elsewhere. How do people respond to you at home and abroad with this approach to things? Because I could see people maybe say, like, this, everyone would have a problem with what you're saying, Jon. Can't you pick a side?
Right. Well, when I have conversations with people, I first try to listen to them. And of course, this is something that's emphasized the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University as a Benedictine value, to listen with the ear of the heart. So this is something I tried to do even before I came here, and it was very encouraging and inspiring to be in an environment that encourages that kind of listening in principle, and certainly in practice as well. So so for me, listening is important. And the second thing when I engage in conversations with different kind of people is I try to understand what the common ground is between them and me. And so I always try to start with what we have in common, because it's really hard to have a conversation with somebody if the first thing that the two people do is emphasize their differences, because it can create all kinds of tension. All right. Now, the second point with respect to the book is that I think that one of the hardest things about writing the book for me was to not come across as being too critical or negative about the United States. Because the very people whom I study in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon, and that is not to say that all Shiites are anti-American, because
Mhm.
that's just false. But the people who were involved in these revolutionary movements and are involved in these revolutionary movements are very critical of the United States' policy in the Middle East.
Mhm.
And and most of the people who read my book will probably be Americans. So I wanted to be able to critique American policy in such a way that was true to the thoughts of the revolutionaries themselves
Mhm.
without going too far, because if I went too far, I'd alienate my
Yeah.
audience. So those are some of the thoughts that come to mind when I think about your question.
That's great, John. Yeah, and each of your readers, obviously we encourage folks to read your book, otherwise we wouldn't be interviewing you about it here. But each reader will of course, you're inviting them to look at the evidence and come to their own assessment. You know, so each will respond to you in their own way. But I just want to say, from my perspective, I found it a remarkably even-handed approach to this in a way that really promotes discussion, and that's sometimes hard to find on issues like this, and I just want to thank you for it.
You're
um,
welcome, and thanks for your kind words. I appreciate that.
well, let's talk more about Iran, right? And we want to have an opportunity to talk a bit about Iraq and Lebanon as well. But let's start with Iran. This is, you described it as a pivot point of this book, and let's make it a pivot point for this conversation.
Hmm.
The history of Iran with the West is a lengthy one, right, including the United States. I'm going to ask you one of these impossible questions, okay? In your estimation, if you had to pick, what are the three single most important events in Iran-US relations, and why? If our audience could only remember three after this conversation today, they'll remember more than that, but let's just say three. What would be the three that you would want them to remember?
The United States' successful attempt in toppling Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the rightfully elected prime minister of Iran, and that coup that the United States and Britain perpetrated against Mossadegh occurred in 1953. That's a major turning point because of the enormous resentment and bitterness that a lot of Iranians feel about that, because they believe that the United States, which stands up for freedom and democracy and liberty and so on, worked successfully to topple a rightfully elected Iranian prime minister who
Mhm.
was very much of an Iranian nationalist. So that is something that is very much embedded in the historical consciousness of Iranians who may have experienced it firsthand themselves and or are younger but know about it.
Mhm.
I think and know about it. The second major event involves Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979, because up until 1979, the United States and Iran had very good diplomatic relations.
Mhm.
Of course, the United States supported Iran's king and did an enormous amount to aid and assist him in oppression domestically within Iran. And it was Iran's Islamic Revolution and subsequent events that caused the end of diplomatic relations between the US and Iran. Now, when I say end, we don't know whether it's permanent or not, but it's been in place certainly since 1979.
Mhm.
The next major event in Iran-US relations was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, also known and more commonly known as the Iran Nuclear Accords,
Okay.
which were signed under the Obama administration, and which created it was a set of international accords, which created a situation where Iran, in exchange for having sanctions against it suspended
Mhm.
or reduced, Iran would then curtail its nuclear program in exchange for that. And of course, the current administration of President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from those nuclear accords, although all the other countries that were a party to it continue to be. So I think that the overthrow of Mossadegh, Iran's Islamic Revolution, and the Iran nuclear accords are three of the most significant events in U.S.-Iran relations.
Thank you for that, John. And maybe
You're welcome.
you mentioned the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. So there's always a bit of lag time with when one publishes a book and the most recent developments on it. But at this point, the United States, can you confirm this for us? The United States has removed itself. They've reimposed sanctions at this point. And other nations who were involved in that agreement are still honoring it. And we're sort of at an impasse right now, trying to figure out what's going to happen next. My sense is who's going to buckle under pressure? Will it be Iran to reinvite a renegotiation, or additional pressure from the U.S.? Is that an accurate depiction, or how would you describe it in your words?
Well, the most a person can do when it comes to the future is guess, or at best kind of engaged in an educated guess. And on more than one occasion, Joe Biden, as a presidential candidate, and even before, has stated that he would position the United States in such a way that it would rejoin the Iran nuclear accords if he were elected.
Okay.
So it's very difficult. First, we don't know whether Trump is going to be reelected or whether Joe Biden will be elected president. So that's an open question.
Mm-hmm.
Second, if Joe Biden is elected, we don't know exactly how the Iranians would respond to the United States attempting to rejoin the agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Because as an agreement was being negotiated, as it was signed and afterwards, different Iranians within the country had very different opinions about the nuclear accords.
Okay.
I mean, there were some Iranians who were very much in favor of it and thought it would be a very good thing for the country. There were other Iranians, and some of those people still might welcome the United States rejoining the agreement. There are other Iranians who may be considered hardline, who believed that Iran was selling out to one of Iran's worst adversaries in making this agreement, and those hardline Iranians are very proud of Iran's nuclear program and want it to be expanded to the extent possible. So if Biden is elected and he positions the United States to rejoin the agreement, I think that a lot of these debates in Iran will become all the more noticeable and all the more vigorous. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen. If Trump's reelected, it's very unlikely. I mean, it's almost impossible he's going to rejoin the agreement, because this is one of the planks of his.
Mm-hmm.
Has been one of the planks of his campaign, and has been one of for him and a lot of his supporters, a very important policy point that he's withdrawn the United States from the agreement.
Thank you. Okay,
You're
so
welcome.
We can't fully know the future, but one thing we do know for sure, and that's that the upcoming presidential election will be consequential for U.S.-Iran relations, among other issues as well.
Yes.
Maybe, why don't we, if it's okay with you, can we start to bring in some of the other terrain that you explore in this book? With Iraq and with Lebanon, these are important countries as well, countries with connections to Iran, and they help us fully understand Iran and the broader Shiite world. To begin with Iraq,
Mm-hmm.
can you give us a sense for the religious complexity in Iraq?
Sure.
The different groups that are there, the relations between Sunnis and Shias there, perhaps among Shias themselves, and maybe say a bit about why that would matter to the US. In Iran, you're looking at, I think your book cites an 89% of the Muslim population there practices Shia.
Or
Shia,
more.
Or more, okay.
Yeah.
Tell us about Iraq.
Well, okay, I'll talk about Iraq. So, it's in Iran. I may have misunderstood you, and I apologize. It's in Iran where it's probably 90 to 95% Shiite. And Iraq is
Wow.
probably approximately 60% Shiite. And
Okay.
if I misunderstood you, I'm terribly sorry. If I misheard you, I'm
Keep going.
terribly
Keep going.
sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, so Iraq is 60% Shiite. It's probably about 35 to 37% Sunni, and the rest of the population is Christian. I mean, there are other small various religious groups in Iraq as well. So basically, after the United States began its war in Iraq in 2003, and the reason the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 was because it seemed that powerful members of the administration of George W. Bush, including George W. Bush himself, believed that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. And there was also a suggestion that Iraq may have, within that context and consistent with it from the point of view of this argument, that Iraq was working on a nuclear weapons program. And this was very soon after the September 11th, 2001 attacks against the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. The United States had already gone to war against al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan. And the Bush administration was presenting President Saddam Hussein in Iraq as a very significant threat to the United States. Now, it's by point of fact, after the United States went into Iraq, it was clear that Iraq had no nuclear weapons. I mean, this is a matter of this is not a partisan statement. This is just a matter of record. So basically, one result of the war that the United States has been fighting in Iraq since 2003 is that this war and the weakening, and the execution of Saddam Hussein and the weakening of Iraq's government as a result of America's war in Iraq has created a situation where Iran is much, much stronger in Iraq now, and it has a lot more influence in Iraq now than it did before 2003. I mean, Iran has been involved in consistent efforts and quite successfully in a lot of ways in influencing Iraq's Shiites and influencing Iraq's Shiite-led government and so on. And Iran is right next door to Iraq, and some of the holiest sites in Shiite Islam are in Iraq, and others are in Iran. So in terms of the religious complexity of Iraq, Iran's influence in Iraq has become greater in part as a result of the US invasion. All right. Now, another part of the complexity of Iraq involves the war that took place between Iran and Iraq between 1980 and 1989, where huge numbers of Iranians and huge numbers of Iraqis were killed. The border after the war ended was between Iran and Iraq was exactly the same as the border before the war even started. Nothing was gained except for the horrors of huge numbers of people dying on both sides. Now, it's not as if all of Iraq's Shiites are excited about Iran's influence in Iraq. I mean, they have all kinds of, there are Iraqis, some of whom welcome Iran, but others who have very long memories about the horrors of the war and hold deep resentments against Iran because of the Iran-Iraq war. And there are also, in addition to that, there is some rivalry and even bitterness on the part of the Iraqis because virtually all of a very high percentage of the Iraqi Shiites are Arab, so they're ethnically Arab and their language is Arabic. And Iran is culturally different from the Arabic world. Iranians speak Persian or Farsi, two words for the same language, and they have a very different historical legacy from the Iraqis. So it's not as if the Iranians have a completely free hand in Iraq just because the country has such a high Shiite population. There are all kinds of complexities in the relationships between and among Shiites within Iraq and between and among Iraqi Shiites' relationships with Iranians for some of the reasons that I mentioned.
And within this context, though, if I'm thinking back again to Saddam Hussein and Baathists, those that would have been a Sunni government at that point. And so the Shiites that you're describing then in Iraq, when it comes to they had troubles on both sides. There were repressive policies on the one hand from Saddam Hussein and Sunnis, but on the other hand, fighting this horrific war with Iran. Iran was also in some sense an adversary. So it's not a clear line here in terms of what your response to Iran would be in the Shiites there.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Saddam Hussein, yes, was a was a Sunni Muslim and probably may well have had certain personal religious commitments with respect to Sunni Islam. Okay, I mean, all these things are possible, and what you're saying about this matter is very, very important. There's just no question about it.
Okay.
But at the same time, Saddam Hussein led a government that was secularist in its foundation.
Yes.
Ba'ath in Arabic means resurgence or renewal. The Ba'ath Party was started as a socialist party in the Arab world in the earlier part of the 20th century. The Ba'ath Party was very active and continues to be active in Syria. That's the party of Bashar al-Assad, who's the president of Syria. It was the party of Saddam Hussein. So even though Saddam Hussein may have shown a kind of favoritism towards certain Sunnis in Iraq, the ideological and constitutional and legal foundations of Iraq under Saddam Hussein were largely secular, even though Sunnis in the government may have shown favoritism towards fellow Sunnis. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because if we just kind of try to take a step back and look at various countries in the Middle East, I'm not saying every one, but many countries in the Middle East have a secular foundation to their constitutions and laws and governments, like Syria, such as Jordan, to a certain extent, even though Lebanon has a sectarian system, there's secularism at its foundation. And the same would apply to Egypt, for instance. So Iran is a country that's under a Shiite government, and Saudi Arabia that's a country that's under a Sunni Islamic government, in a way are exceptions in the Middle East because Sharia law or Islamic law forms the foundation of these two countries' laws. And in that way, they're quite different than certain other countries in the Middle East too, even a country such as Turkey, for instance, which in principle has secularism at its base in terms of its laws and constitutions. So these are worth noting in terms of the broader context of Middle East politics, in my view.
Yeah, and I think what you've just said here is an excellent example too of just how complex the situation is in any one of these countries. There are a number of different sects with a number of different loyalties and experiences that pull in different directions, and that anytime a country is trying to formulate and negotiate policy in regard to these countries, it has to have a level of sensitivity to that complexity.
I agree completely. The complexity and the nuance and the subtlety of what's taking place and the multiplicity of identities, because I mean it's just at times it can be far too simplistic to simply divide Iraq between Sunni Arabs and Shiite Arabs and Kurds in the north, okay? Because there are so many ambiguities, so many complexities, so much subtlety within and among the relationships that the people have with each other. And another crucial aspect of this involves historical memory, okay? I mean, for the Kurds, a very high percentage of whom, in terms of Iraq, I mean, there are Kurds who live in Iraq and Turkey and in Syria and Iran. They have very large populations in those countries and other places. But you know, the Kurds, in terms of Iraq, many of whom live in the northern part of the country, um, some of them at least have a soft spot in their heart for the United States. Now, I'm not saying every single Kurd is pro-American,
Mhm.
but ever since the United States attacked Iraq in 1990-91, when the United States tried to and succeeded in ejecting Iraqi soldiers from Kuwait in 1990-91, as that was taking place, the United States put in place in northern Iraq a semi-autonomous region. And that was in part for the purpose of trying to weaken the regime of Saddam Hussein. So, so when the Kurds think of the American wars in Iraq, they certainly must think of ways that they may have been harmed by them. But
Mhm.
Kurds also probably give some thought to the fact that starting in 1990-91, the United States went to great lengths to try to create a semi-autonomous region for the Kurds in northern Iraq.
Mhm.
And then different Arab Sunnis and different Arab Shiites in Iraq may have their own interpretations of history. So when we talk about individual and communal identities within the Middle East, as your question suggests, the manner in which groups of people perceive their own histories and construct their own histories in terms of their religious and ethnic identities are very important.
That's excellent. Thank you, John.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Um, I want to have an opportunity to talk about Lebanon too, but maybe if we could stay on Iraq for a moment more, I'd love to ask another question. Um, as you close your chapter on Iraq in Shia Islam and politics, you mention at one point a glimmer of hope, right? So Iraq is a country that is still in a precarious state, as I would understand it, following the most recent war in which the U.S. was engaged and its recovery from that conflict, trying to put in place a stable government, trying to maintain control over its own borders, trying to forge some kind of a common unifying civic identity in the midst of all of these all of this complexity and these pulls in different directions as we've been describing. You mentioned, so Iraq is facing a lot of challenges. I couldn't help but notice, again, your mention of a glimmer of hope in Iraq, in reference specifically to Shia intellectual life and education in Iraq. Can you say more about that? And again, why should we take note of that? Why is that significant for us?
Well, one of the characteristics of Shiite Islam throughout much of its history has been the enormous intellectual rigor within Shiism and the high appreciation which Shiite intellectuals have for vigorous debate of various kinds.
Okay.
Shiite Islam has incorporated within itself many dimensions of Islamic spirituality. Shiite Islam has integrated within its sphere very vigorous debates and insights from Islamic theology, Islamic philosophy, even Western forms of Christian theology and various forms of Western political thought have found meaning, have found traction and a kind of lucidity within the Shiite framework and within Shiite seminaries. So the Shiite seminaries of Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon are very vigorous centers of intellectual life, where people are discussing a whole variety of issues as they relate to religion and politics. And one of the reasons that's hopeful is because when religious people, for instance, have differing viewpoints about various topics, it creates a kind of flexibility in their outlook. because they're not just reinforcing every single idea that the other person has as if they're clones. No, they're trying to develop arguments. They're trying to use evidence and logical constructions of ideas in terms of expressing their viewpoints. Okay, so I mean, as a glimmer of hope, for instance, there's at least one university in Rome, and I know I'm moving to Iran, but this certainly relates to Iraq, which over the years has been very conscious and very intentional in terms of trying to promote dialogue between Shiites and non-Shiites, between Shiites and Christians, and Shiites and Hindus and other kinds of people. And so the Islamic seminaries in Iraq have been part and parcel of that as well. Okay. Now, there's one thing I want to add to this idea of intellectual activity within Shiite Islam. After I finished writing the book, I continued my conversations with various people whom I'd interviewed for the book. And there's a fascinating development that's been taking place over at least the last 3 years within Shiite seminaries in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon. And that is that Sunnis from various parts, Sunni Muslims from various parts of the world, and people who are not Muslims at all, have been attending Shiite seminaries. Some of these people have converted to Shiite Islam because they want to learn more about Shiite Islam. Their first and second choices are usually to go to Iran and or Iraq, but many of these new Shiites are going to Shiite seminaries in Lebanon because they can't, and the education they receive at the Lebanese Shiite seminaries is quite good as well, but because they're not able to gain admission at the seminaries in Iran and Iraq because there's so many people enrolled there. So the implications of this are that the Sunni Shiite rivalry in the Middle East goes far beyond warfare, the potential for warfare. It goes far beyond the confrontations that we see in places like Iraq and Yemen and Syria, and to a certain extent in Lebanon. There is a fight to the finish between Sunnis and Shiites for the heart and soul of Islam. Because one of the reasons that the members of the Sunnis who are the leaders of some governments in the Middle East are so worried is because they see that there are people converting to Shiite Islam, sometimes in very large numbers, and that constitutes both a religious and a political threat to them. So a glimmer of hope in the Iraqi seminaries and the Iraqi Shiite seminaries could be a glimmer of hope for certain Shiites who want people to convert to Shiite Islam.
And at the same time, I did find it notable that you're describing a certain amount of flexibility within intellectual debate within Shiite Islam. It's not as though, while there are certain enduring traditions, enduring and defining beliefs, this is not wholly an immutable and unchanging religious and cultural system. This is something that is debating and capable of evolving over time in different ways.
Yes, definitely. Just to take a step back,
please. Yeah.
There's no question that there's an enormous amount of intellectual vitality and intellectual debate within the Sunni tradition. All right.
Okay.
There's of course there is. Okay. But in my opinion, one of the things that has occurred with respect to Sunni Islam over, let's say, at least the past 40 to 50 years is that certain Sunni Islamist groups, such as Al-Qaeda, which attacked the United States on September 11th, 2001, such as the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, also known as ISIS or ISIL, which continues to be active in Iraq and Syria and other places. Sunni groups such as the Taliban, for instance, have attempted to put forward a very specific and very rigid Sunni ideology. And some of these groups have been supported by the Saudi government. I mean, there's just no question about that. And I'm not laying blame on anybody. I'm just trying to set the context. And these groups have been influential. They have had a very substantial impact on Sunni Muslims who are members of these Sunni groups and Sunni Muslims who are outside of these Sunni groups. And one of the reasons that these Sunni Islamist groups are so attractive is precisely because their ideology is so specific and so formulaic and so understandable.
Okay.
Yet, one aspect that is lost in these simple formulas that these Sunni Islamist groups put forward, one thing that's lost is intellectual vigor and intellectual rigor and a forum for debate. And this is very different from the way Shiite Islam typically operates.
Interesting.
Because I mean, for hundreds of years, Shiite Islamic theology, Shiite Islamic philosophy, the philosophies of the ancients, such as Aristotle, whom I know among your many, many other areas of knowledge, you know very well as a classicist. These have always been part of the Shiite conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that if Shiite Islam is intellectually appealing to large masses of people, which may well be the case, one of the reasons is because it's maintained this kind of foundation with respect to its intellectual heritage.
Thank you, Jon.
You're welcome.
Let's turn to Lebanon. Let's talk about Lebanon some more. You've referenced it at different points, but let's dig in a bit more there. Lebanon is in another state, the third state that you focus in on in this most recent book of yours. It's a relatively small state within the Middle East. Can you talk to us about how Shias there and their vision compare to the Shias of Iran and Iraq, and with what consequence? Why is that important, those differences? Along these lines, Hezbollah is just one Shiite group within Lebanon. Maybe you could talk about Hezbollah in this context too, and how does this relationship also enrich our views of Iran?
Okay, sure. Well, one of the components that makes Lebanon different from Iran and Iraq is that Lebanon is comprised of a mix of Sunnis, Shiites, and Christians. So just to take on the political level, for instance, Lebanon's president has to be a Maronite Christian. Mm-hmm. Lebanon's prime minister has to be a Sunni Muslim. Mm-hmm. The speaker of the parliament in Lebanon has to be a Shiite Muslim. Mm-hmm. And no single religious or sectarian group in Lebanon's parliament is allowed to have representation of over 50% of the seats in the parliament. So Iran and Iraq don't function this way. I mean, there's certainly small Christian populations in Iran and Iraq, but they don't carry the kind of influence in Iran and Iraq that they do in Lebanon.
Okay.
So Hezbollah is one of the most powerful Shiite political parties in Lebanon. Hezbollah is one of the most powerful organizations in other ways in Lebanon, has had to find its place within this very diverse religious context. So within Hezbollah, there are a lot of differences of opinion regarding what the organization's future in Lebanon should be.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the most hardline members of Hezbollah want the whole of Lebanon to become an Islamic state, very similar to that of Iran.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I think it would be very unfair to Hezbollah to say that every single member of that organization wants that, because they don't. On the other side of the spectrum, there are members of Hezbollah who basically say that they totally respect and honor Lebanon's religious diversity,
Hmm.
and they believe that Hezbollah should try to continue to live in peace to the extent possible with all of Lebanon's sectarian groups. And there are various members of Hezbollah in the middle, and who have all kinds of different opinions there. So
And
go ahead.
if I may, John, is this one of the things that I took away from your book is that the relationship of Hezbollah with the political landscape of Lebanon is something that has evolved and changed a bit over time, and it has reached a point where it is engaged with the political conversation. It is a part of the political process within Lebanon. And as a part of this process, in some sense, it's reframed its mission to an extent to place the future well-being of Lebanon as a whole state as central to its concern. Not just only Shiites, however, like for the broader country. If, insofar as that's true, that would strike me as a much more inclusive vision than I think I would have thought previously, and maybe many viewers and listeners would have noticed as well.
And I think there are elements within Hezbollah that want that. And again, there are other elements in Hezbollah who just want the Shiites to take over the whole country and have an Islamic republic.
Yeah.
And the other crucial factor in all this is that Lebanon's Christian parties are split. You see, the Free Patriotic Movement is one of Lebanon's very powerful and popular Christian parties.
Okay.
The leader of the Maronite Christian Free Patriotic Movement, or that party, is Michel Aoun, who is the president of Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
And that party, under Aoun's leadership, has been and continues to be in a political coalition with Hezbollah. Okay? So I'm not saying that every Christian who's a member of the Free Patriotic Movement is just really excited about this alliance with Hezbollah, because some of the Christians in the Free Patriotic Movement may be very, very skeptical of Aoun's relationship with Hezbollah, and others may be more supportive. But one of the reasons that, at least on paper, Hezbollah has been able to maintain its power, at least in theory or in principle, is because of its alliance with this very powerful Maronite Christian party.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in sharp contrast to that, virtually every other Christian party in Lebanon is opposed to Hezbollah, like the Lebanese Forces and the Kataib Party and so on. So this Christian alliance with Hezbollah plays a very significant role in Lebanese politics.
Thank you for that, John.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have a few more questions, if I may. Okay. One, I thought we'd follow up with Hezbollah just for a moment. One component of Hezbollah's policy has been a rejection of the state of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And we would be remiss if we didn't note some of the developments most recently with Israel in recent weeks. And that is that Israel has been newly recognized as a state by the United Arab Emirates and by Bahrain.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could tell us how significant that is, how significant of a development that is for the Shia Sunni world.
Well, I think it's a very significant development for the Sunni and Shiite world, and I also think it's a very significant development for the Middle East as a whole, even for people who are not Sunnis and Shiites. In terms of historical context, Benjamin Netanyahu and his allies have been working very, very, very hard for many, many years to try to build as many alliances with the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf as they possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
So the announcement recently of diplomatic relations between Israel and the UAE and Israel and Bahrain have come about as a result of a lot of hard work on the part of people in all three of these countries and also on the part of American diplomats.
Mm-hmm.
The ramifications of it for Iran's security could be substantial because Bahrain and the UAE, that is, say, the United Arab Emirates, are geographically very close to Iran.
Mm-hmm.
So it's conceivable. Now I'm engaging in some intentional hypothesizing, okay?
Sure.
But it's conceivable that one aspect of the deal that exists between Israel on the one hand and the UAE and Bahrain could be an increase in highly sophisticated arms on the part of both Israel and the United States being sold to these two countries. Now, I'm not saying this is definitely going to happen, but I am saying that it's conceivable because the United States has had a longstanding policy that it will not sell some of its most destructive and sophisticated weapons to countries that don't have diplomatic relations with Israel.
Ah, okay.
So yes, it's an embedded part of U.S. Middle East policy. So what could happen? And I think we're already starting to see some inklings of this in news reports. Israel is probably going to use the UAE and Bahrain as a place to help it spy on Iran.
Mm-hmm.
I think that because the UAE and the Bahraini government are very worried about Iran's expansion, they're at least going to buy some more weapons to try to at least symbolically ask the Iranians to back off a bit.
Okay.
And I do think that geostrategically, in terms of the Persian Gulf, this at least somewhat puts Iran back on its heels, at least a little bit. And we're going to have to see the way things unfold, but this is how it looks for now.
Thank you, Jon.
You're welcome.
You brought the U.S. up again in terms of its relationship to Middle Eastern politics in this case. Maybe one further question on that, if you don't mind. Often, we speak of alliances being formed with a fixation on a common enemy. In the Shia world, one such enemy would be the U.S., to our great detriment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Is there a way for the U.S. to avoid that role? Is there a way, in other words, for the U.S. to build an alliance or some degree of community based on mutual interests with the Shia world, and maybe even not with just vilifying another third-party group? That's a very difficult question, but...
Well, fortunately, the United States and Lebanon have diplomatic relations. So I think that the diplomatic relations that exist between the American and Lebanese governments can be a foothold.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now I'm going to say something that's unthinkable to some people, and before I say the unthinkable, I'm going to preface it. I mean, Germany and France fought at least two horrific wars against each other, and they eventually became partners. All right. The United States and Germany and the United States and Japan fought their wars against each other and were fatal enemies, and they found peace. The United States pursued a horrific war in Vietnam, and for many years, the United States and Vietnam have diplomatic relations. Now, if it's possible for so many enemies and so many other enemies in history to make peace with each other, Is it conceivable that Israel and Iran, Israel and Hezbollah could make peace with each other, and that the United States could make peace with Iran and Hezbollah again? Maybe. Okay. So, I mean, what would be the common interest that the United States and Iran would share, for example, that could form a basis for an understanding?
Mm-hmm.
Well, potentially the United States re-entering the Iran nuclear accords.
Okay.
Also, it seems to me that the Iran and the United States have a mutual interest in maintaining stability in the Persian Gulf. Iran and the United States have a common interest in opposing Sunni Islamist groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria.
Mm-hmm.
They have, over the long term, they may have a common interest in maintaining stability in oil markets. They would have long-term interest in maintaining stability in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they would also have a long-term interest in avoiding war with each other, meaning
Mm-hmm.
the United States and Iran.
Sure.
So this all sounds very simplistic and very naive because all of these areas are territories of massive competition and rivalry between Iran and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes the very areas of rivalry can constitute a foundation for peace. And so, in line with your question, these are some of my observations.
Thank you for those. And we
welcome.
all hope that the unthinkable becomes thinkable.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I do too. I do too.
Maybe one more question.
Sure.
Can you tell us what you're going to work on next now that you've completed this project? What is up for you next, Jon?
My current book project is tentatively titled The Armenian Diaspora and Modern Political Systems.
Mm-hmm.
And the Armenians are a very large and very significant ethnic group, many of whom live in Central Asia and the Middle East, and certainly in many, many other parts of the world as part of the Armenian diaspora. So this book on which I'm working, and I'm very, very grateful to Haigazian University Press in Beirut, Lebanon, for commissioning me to write it. It's examining the constitutions of various Middle Eastern, North African, and Mediterranean countries where Armenians are religious and ethnic minorities, and virtually all Armenians are Christians.
Okay.
And the book is examining the ways in which these governments and these constitutions approach Armenians and other religious and ethnic minorities within these countries. So it dovetails with the book I just wrote because there are Armenians in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, and there are going to be chapters in this upcoming book on Armenians in those countries as well. There are other points of overlap too, but that's some of it there.
Just in brief, is there a point, I mean, I when I hear the word constitutional, my ears perk up, and I think there are we're very interested in the Constitution right now in the United States. We have been for a long time. This will be an issue we'll hear a lot more about with a new, selection of a Supreme Court justice coming, and discussion of what's constitutional and what's not, right? Is there a dovetail here as well with the West with constitution? So the book that you just did with Shia, Islam, and Politics, it talks a lot about U.S. interaction here. Are there any connections with the United States for this topic?
Yes. In my opinion, the Constitution of the United States and the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was written of course, the U.S. Constitution was written in the 18th century. The UN Declaration of Human Rights was written in the middle part of the 20th century. But the American Constitution, in my opinion, has had a very significant impact on the constitutions of the Middle East and the constitutions in other parts of the world. I'm not saying that every Middle Eastern country has 3 branches of government. Legislative, executive, and judicial. I'm not saying that necessarily, but many of them do, and a portion of their constitutions are divided in terms of giving attention to the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Second point, the United States' Bill of Rights, that is to say the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, in terms of a broad host of topics like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, prohibitions against unlawful search and seizure, the right to a speedy trial, the right to an attorney, et cetera, one finds many of those principles in constitutions within Middle Eastern countries as well. So, I mean, when it comes to political conversations, could some people in the Middle East who believe in these principles and Americans who believe in these principles potentially have constructive and vigorous conversations about such topics? I think it's possible.
Oh, John, you make me excited about your next project.
Thank you.
The issue of Armenia and Armenians and the Armenian diaspora, this is a difficult and a controversial subject. But honestly, I can't think of a better person to walk us through it. That's going to be incredibly beneficial. And again, this the connection to the U.S. Constitution, that's incredibly interesting too. I suspect that my experience in reading your upcoming book will probably be comparable to my experience reading Shia Islam and Politics. With this book was a book that I think takes its reader to other lands, takes its reader to the Middle East, only to return, takes its Western reader there, only to return us back in our own context with a series of questions for ourselves, an opportunity for self-reflection and even a new self-awareness. So with that expectation, I look forward to that new book too. John, I want to thank you for what has been a very enlightening conversation.
And thank you for your questions and your insights and your comments. It's been a wonderful experience for me as well. So thank you.
Well, let me wish you best of luck on your new project. We look forward to reading it. I want to thank our viewers and our listeners for being with us today on behalf of the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning. Thank you all very much, and good night.